everyone, I'm Leanne.
And I'm Masoretic Mike.
And this is Unschooled History. Welcome to part 3 of our 4-part episode on the history of the Bible. Now, of course, before there was Christianity, there was
Judaism.
And the earliest mention that we have of Israel is an Egyptian inscription from the 13th century BC.
Yeah, it's quite a long time ago.
Well, it's the early Iron Age.
Yeah.
And that is when Judaism first became distinct from the ancient Canaanite polytheism from which it evolved. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which we discussed in part 2, are the earliest known copies that we have of the Jewish scripture. We don't know what manuscripts have been lost to time.
We do know that there are some scripts called the Nag Hammadi texts, which have been misplaced, but they're not that old. They're just misplaced texts.
Many of these Nag Hammadi texts include apocryphal gospels, such as the Gospel of Judas and the Gospel of Thomas.
Yes. And the Gospel of Mary and Gospel of... Oh, boy. There's a second Gospel of Peter, I want to say.
Yeah. But they're not that old. They're, relatively speaking, they're not that old. But this is the Codex Vaticanus, so called because it's kept in the Vatican for preservation purposes. Before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, this was the oldest known copy of the Jewish scriptures, and it dates to approximately 300 to 325 AD. Unlike the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were written in Hebrew, the Codex Vaticanus is written in Greek, and it's representative of the Septuagint. So now let's talk about the Septuagint. What is it? Where did it come from? What makes it different from the Hebrew scriptures that we have today? Those answers are simple. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, but it has books in it that modern Jews do not recognize, but that were recognized in the 3rd century BC when the translation happened at the behest of Ptolemy II, whose father, Ptolemy I, was a Greek man who had risen from serving under Alexander the Great to becoming an Egyptian pharaoh.
We should note those are recognized by the Hellenistic Jews.
Yes, the Hellenistic Jews. Part of the Hellenistic diaspora.
Yeah,
diaspora. Yeah. I can pronounce things, I swear.
I know you can.
Okay, so the reason he asked for this translation was to put it into the library at Alexandria. Ugh, that was a great loss.
Yeah.
Okay, so, of course, the library at Alexandria no longer exists, and the oldest copy of the Septuagint that we have is this, a scroll called Papyrus Fuad 266. It's not complete. It's really just the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament.
But the Hebrews would know as the Torah.
The word Septuagint comes from the Latin for 70, but it doesn't have 70 books, obviously. After all, even the Catholic Bible, which uses the Septuagint for the Old Testament, only contains 72. Actually, the full title in English is The Translation of 70 Interpreters.
Mm-hmm.
The legend is that Ptolemy summoned 72 Jewish elders, placed each in a separate chamber, and went to each and asked each, individually, to translate the Torah. Miraculously, each of the 72 created an identical translation. The truth is, however, that the translation was done in stages and was followed over the next 2 centuries by the rest of the books of the Old Testament.
Correct.
Okay, but how close is it to what we know today?
Actually quite close.
We know it's closest to the Masoretic text and the Latin Vulgate.
Yeah.
There's like one notable difference.
Oh, I'm trying to remember what the difference is.
Genesis 4:7.
Oh, yeah.
The Septuagint reads, "If you offer correctly, but do not divide correctly, have you not sinned? Be still. His recourse is to you, and you will rule over him." The Vulgate reads, "If thou do well, shalt thou not receive? But if ill, shall not sin forthwith be present at the door? But the lust thereof shall be under thee, and thou shalt have dominion over it." This is like the one big difference between the original Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate, which is kind of cool. Now, there's idiomatic differences that don't translate well, and translations are done sense for sense, or word for word, or some combination thereof. It's something that's easy to see in something like the idiom, "It's Greek to me."
Yeah.
The Greeks say, "This strikes me as Chinese," while the Chinese say, "Is this ghost script in Cantonese?" or "Is this a book from heaven?" in Mandarin. The sense is the same in all of these phrases, even if the words aren't.
Yes.
Now let's talk about the Gospels and the New Testament. How old is it? Who wrote what? Who decided what books made the cut? Well, I'll tell you what we do not know about who wrote what. We don't know exact names.
No.
We have assumptions based on tradition and upon scholarly research.
And who was accredited with it.
Exactly. But that's all we have. So it's huge. And we're starting with the Gospels. As we discussed in part 1, there are 3 synoptic Gospels: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then there's John, which has different source material. But wait, there's more! There's also the Apocryphal Gospels. There are several Apocryphal Gospels out there. We're going to touch on the more famous ones. This one is the Gospel of James. It's also known as the Proto-Evangelium of James, or the infancy narrative.
Yes.
The Gospel of James is what's called pseudo-epigraphia. What it means is that a later author pretended to be someone who lived in an earlier time period. Scholarly consensus is that it was composed sometime in the middle of the 2nd century, a full century later than the person the author claims to be lived. The Gospel of James extends Luke's narrative back in time to the birth of the Virgin Mary to Saints Anne and Joachim, who were elderly and unable to conceive until God intervened. This is a common theme within Scripture, as we also see in the stories of women like Sarah, Hannah, and Elizabeth. The narrative then jumps ahead to when Mary is 12 and has an angel coming and choosing Joseph to be her husband. The third major thing that this narrative contains is the first written record of a gynecological exam, when a midwife confirms Mary's continued virginity, as does a woman named Salome, who gets her hand burned for her trouble and her doubt. The text is also the earliest text to assert that Joseph is a widower who has children from his first wife. Hence why we see things like James, the brother of Jesus, on ossuaries.
Yes.
That, and let's face it, Jesus was actually a fairly common name.
Yes, Barabbas, his first name was Jesus.
Yes. And of course it would have been pronounced as
Jesus. Jesu.
Okay, first you give Spanish, then you give Latin. Give the Hebrew.
Yeshua.
Thank you. This is the infancy Gospel of Thomas, not to be confused with the other Gospel of Thomas.
No, that one is different.
There's also an illustration from it of a young Jesus bringing some clay birds to life. And it's one of what's called the Gnostic Gospels. It's unknown whether it was originally written in Greek or Syriac. The narrative consists mainly of the time the Holy Family was in Egypt, and there is some warped stuff in it.
It is one of the lesser accepted Gospels because it people still like to read it because it portrays Christ as a child, and it covers the time when we don't know much about Christ's life.
But, like I said, there's some warped stuff in it. Jesus actually kills 2 other children and strikes the second child's parents blind for daring to complain to Joseph and Mary about it. Then, after correcting his teachers, who have started to suspect Jesus' supernatural origin, he reverses all of those curses and killings and starts resurrecting and healing people. This manuscript is the inspiration for an Anne Rice novel.
Yes.
She actually wrote the novel Christ the Lord out of Egypt after returning to Roman Catholicism, and she based it off of this particular infancy narrative. But, of course, she's left Roman Catholicism again.
I have listened to part of the book. I haven't heard the whole thing.
Yeah, I remember, and that's how I remembered that the novel was based on this particular narrative.
Yeah.
I remember us trying to listen to that sham of a work. No offense to Anne Rice fans or to Anne Rice herself, we didn't like it. Here's the other Gospel of Thomas. It was written between 60 and 140 AD. It's another Gnostic text, and by now you're probably wondering, okay, unschooled history, who were the Gnostics? They were basically a group who emphasized personal knowledge over orthodoxy. They were moderate in most morality, but ascetic sexually and in their diet. They didn't believe God created everything. Instead, they believed there was a supreme hidden God and a lesser malevolent deity who created the physical world. They couldn't even agree on whether or not Jesus was divine, and some even called him an anti-Messiah. But back to this particular gospel. It is in fact proto-Gnostic, and scholars consider it to be highly important in understanding the Q document, and it contains about half of the narrative found in the Synoptic Gospels. Did you know all that?
Yeah, but it is very popular, and a lot of people still read it because it is related to Q.
Well, that just gives you more of a scholarly edge.
Yes.
It does not make you a scholar if you just read this book once, by the way. Now, if you actually devote a ton of time to studying it and all of the little intricacies, then you're a scholar. Or a geek. Not sure which.
A little of both. I've actually found free sources online, legitimate free sources, and I've downloaded about 40 of the Gnostic Gospels.
Thus spake my husband, the geek. But it's okay because he's my geek and I love him. And if we weren't history geeks in general, we probably wouldn't be doing this channel, would we, honey?
No.
This, my dears, is the Gospel of Judas. And if you've been on Wikipedia reading about any of the Gnostic Gospels, you've seen this image on every freaking page. It is the first page of the Gospel of Judas. Again, this is a Gnostic Gospel, and like many of the Gnostic Gospels, it contradicts much of what is taught in the biblical canon. But the Gospel of Judas takes it a step further. In it, Judas is portrayed as a heroic figure who receives the true secret teachings that directly contradict everything that Jesus teaches the other disciples, and in it, Jesus tells Judas that Judas will come to rule over all the others.
The Gospel of Judas portrays Judas as a hero, more or less, and that he knows he's going to have to sacrifice himself, so to speak. And it's messed up.
It is. It's completely messed up, and I don't know what's more messed up. Some of the stuff in the infancy narrative of Thomas, or the Gospel of Judas.
You would have to be understand the schools of Gnosticism didn't accept all the Gnostic Gospels. Each school had their own set of Gnostic Gospels that they accepted.
Because, like we said, it was all about personal knowledge, not orthodoxy.
Yeah.
And it's akin to basically starting a new church based not on what you have been taught, but your own personal interpretation of the Bible. Which, never mind, I'm not going there. Historically,
controversial.
no, historically speaking, though, that is actually why we have Protestant churches as well as the Catholic and Orthodox Church. Is because
The difference between
the differences in interpretation.
And who can translate and who can't.
Exactly. So that is the actual historical reason for the Protestant Revolution and everything else. So there you go. There is history there to that. And I think it's pretty obvious at this point why the Gospel of Judas is not included in the biblical canon. Thank you. Finally, we are coming to the only major apocryphal gospel with a woman's name on it. This is the Gospel of Mary. It's a 5th century work in Sahidic Coptic, which is the language that replaced ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. Scholars are unsure which Mary in the New Testament this Mary is supposed to be, although Mary Magdalene is a favorite because of her known status as one of Jesus' followers. That being said, it's not a gospel in the technical sense, because of a gospel focuses on the life and teachings of Jesus, and the Gospel of Mary focuses on what occurs during and after the crucifixion and resurrection, as well as time after. There's a lot of focus on Mary, and it's a little infamous because this is the text in which Peter asks Mary for what things Jesus might have told her in secret, and then he and Andrew reject what she says because it's so different from what Jesus told them, and also likely because she's a woman.
Yes.
He's like, why would Jesus have told you, a woman, this stuff and not us? After all, I'm Peter, I'm the rock, upon which Jesus said he would build his church. And so that's basically what is going on in the Gospel of Mary. And you do have to be wary about what sources that you take. There are fakes out there. They're found as new Gospels, but they're forgeries. A very famous one is this one, the Gospel of Jesus' wife. This fragment is literally all that exists of it. It's about the size of a credit card.
Yeah.
It suggests that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene, something that scholars do not accept. Genuine biblical scholars do not accept that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene. But unschooled history, you say, wasn't it common for rabbis to be married?
It was common for rabbis to be married, but Jesus was not a traditional rabbi. He was different.
But
Jesus was the Christ.
But wasn't Jesus bound by social norms of the time?
Jesus balked at traditional norms. He was a rebel. Yeah, he was a rebel.
I mean, we're talking about someone who, he and his apostles were gleaning through the fields on the Sabbath. He healed on the Sabbath when no work was supposed to be done. And let's not forget that incident in the temple. And he not only went through and cleared the temple with a whip, he actually took the time to make that whip.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a lot of time and effort into something that you're just going to do casually. This was not a spur of the moment thing that Jesus did. He planned it out.
Yeah.
Because whip making is hard, isn't it, honey?
Oh, yeah. I've made a couple.
Okay, well, then there you go. The Sahidic Coptic text on this is messy, it's unpracticed, it's not something you would generally find if someone were writing such an important text. Only a week after it was published in the Harvard Theological Review, it came out that another text in the same collection was definitely a forgery. Radiocarbon dating shows that the papyrus itself is medieval. In 2016, of course, it came out that one of the previous owners had been dismissed from his job at a museum for theft from his workplace. It also came out that this man, whose name was Walter Fritz, was known for selling fake ancient manuscripts on an art website, and that he ran a porn website with his wife, who claimed that she could channel God and Michael the Archangel. That's just bizarre. See, I didn't even know that before I started doing the research for this episode. And I'm like, that all sounds hinky. Every bit of it. And he also admitted that he could have forged it if he wanted to, but denied forging it, but also said that he never claimed it was real, and I don't know. What do you think, honey?
There was a big scandal over it. It rocked the religious world when it was first put out there, and people thought it was real, and then it shook the world again when it was discovered that it was a forgery.
Because text analysis gave further evidence of the fraud, and while the papyrus itself is medieval, as is the ink, it was most likely created in the late 90s using an old piece of papyrus and some ink made in the manner and with the ingredients of ink made in the Middle Ages. They found that the ink had not aged as much as it would have if it had actually been written that long ago. So it's definitely a forgery. And if you want to disagree with whether or not it's a forgery or whatever, go ahead, leave a comment. Just know that the facts are out there, and textual analysis plus ink analysis plus research by a ton of experts has said, yes, it's a forgery, it's a fake. So, no, Jesus was not married to Mary Magdalene or any other woman. Alright, so we've spent a lot of time on the Gospels, haven't we, honey?
Oh, yeah.
Now let's talk about the rest of it. You have the book of Acts, also correctly known as the Acts of the Apostles, as well as the epistles, and, of course, the book of Revelation at the end.
Revelations.
And there are some apocryphal acts out there, like the Acts of Paul.
Oh, yeah.
Which contains the story of Thecla, who traveled around with Paul, got a lot of women to stop sleeping with their husbands. Other women does not get married. Got thrown into the Colosseum, was supposed to be drowned, used it to baptize herself because apparently Paul wouldn't baptize her, which doesn't make a lot of sense because he was baptizing everybody. Whole households that include the men, the women, the children, the servants, everything. Just every living person in the household. And so it doesn't make sense that Paul wouldn't baptize Thecla, but according to this, she baptized herself. And then the Acts of Paul also indicate that Thecla was guarded by lionesses who killed the lions who were sent to eat her. And that's when they had to let her go. And we do have churches named after St. Thecla.
Yeah.
But we have no idea about whether or not she actually existed, while we do have historical evidence that Paul existed. So, you know. But the book of Acts that we see in the Bible, that is canon, it is the Acts of the Apostles.
Yes.
It tells us about the early church. And in telling us about the early church, it tells us about how they worshipped, where they worshipped. It tells us who they worshipped with. It tells us about early church hierarchy. And it's just all really, really cool.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so the epistles. There's two types of epistles. There's the Pauline epistles and the Catholic epistles. And we're going to start with the Pauline epistles because they make up the majority of the New Testament epistles.
I also should point out there are Gnostic epistles, which you will encounter. So if it's not in the Bible and it says it's an epistle,
it's Gnostic.
Yeah. I ran into a few of those.
Obviously, these are called the Pauline epistles because they were all written by a man named Paul.
Yes.
Paul's name was originally
Saul.
He was a Jew who helped to persecute Christians. He took part in the martyrdom of Stephen. But at some point between 31 and 36 AD, Saul was on the way to Damascus when Jesus showed up. Asked why Saul was persecuting him. Saul asked, "Who are you?" And Jesus is all like, "I am Jesus, who you are persecuting." And then Saul was struck blind for 3 days before he repented and was baptized and took the name Paul. This reminds me of a story about my godfather. My godfather's name is Paul, y'all. And the very first time he was acting as a lector, he got the reading that started, "I, Paul, an old man."
I remember that.
And it was right in front of the bishop. And the bishop, if I remember the story correctly as Paul told it to me, the bishop about cracked up in the middle of Mass. And as did everybody else, because, when you have somebody named Paul, who is an older gentleman, saying, "I, Paul, an old man." But, yeah. Paul traveled all around, founding churches, teaching, and writing letters to the churches he had founded, as well as to some of his friends. If there's a place name in the book, such as Rome or Corinth, it's absolutely a Pauline epistle. The letters he wrote to these churches, to the Romans, the Corinthians, the Philippians, the Hebrews, etc., are letters written to these churches to address specific questions that have arisen in each church. His letters to people, on the other hand, were pastoral letters. To Timothy, he was a spiritual father. It's the same with Titus. On the other hand, the letter to Philemon is a prison letter. Paul wrote it while in prison with help from Timothy. Philemon was a very wealthy Christian. He was likely a bishop, like Titus. I mean, Titus was the first bishop of Crete, if I remember correctly.
I think so.
And Paul refers to Philemon as a brother and a fellow laborer for Christ. So he was really close to these people. And of course, in his letters, he mentions women such as Phoebe.
Yeah.
Who were very, very important to the early church. So we know what was going on and who the important players were in the early church, in large part because of Paul. So thank you, Paul, for giving us that information in your letters. Alright, so now let's talk about the Catholic epistles, also known as the general epistles. By saying Catholic epistles, we don't mean that just the Roman Catholic Church believes in them and accepts them as part of the canon, because they are part of the universal canon. In fact, that's why they are called the Catholic epistles. Because in this case, we're talking Catholic with a little c, from the Greek Catholicus. Is it Catholicus? I
think so.
Yeah. For universal. So, the first one of these is James. The author refers to himself as James, but we don't know if it was one of the apostles or someone else. It's unknown if he was writing before or after Paul. Our earliest manuscripts date to the 3rd century, but the textual evidence suggests that it was written before 69 AD. Alright, then there's the Petrine letters, attributed to Simon Peter, to whom the Bible says Jesus gave the keys to the kingdom. Scholars generally agree that yes, he wrote the first one, but no, not the second one. Then you have other scholars who say no to the first one, yes to the second. Both of the Petrine epistles are dated at some point between 60 and 110 AD. Now we're going to talk about the 3 epistles of John. Scholars are in agreement that they were all written by the same person, but not on who that person is, just that he was writing between 85 and 100 AD. What we do know is that it is the same John who wrote the Gospel of John, as well as the book of Revelation. Or is it? Dun dun dun! Mystery! Because the letter writer claims to be one of the apostles, and a name we have for the author of Revelation is John of Patmos, although John of Patmos could have been an apostle, couldn't he have?
Yeah.
We don't know. So, are these all the same John, or are they not? Wikipedia puts them all as the same John.
Which is very possible.
Which is very possible. And I know what y'all are saying. Unschooled history, why are you quoting Wikipedia on this? I'm just saying what Wikipedia says. I'm not saying one way or another from a scholarly point of view on whether or not Wikipedia is right. Because you have people out there who say Wikipedia is bad. Wikipedia is a terrible resource. And you have people out there who say Wikipedia is a great resource and totally accurate because there are editing nerds who work constantly on doing nothing but making sure that Wikipedia is accurate. And then there's people like me who are in the middle, and honey, I think you fall in this category too.
Wikipedia is a good jumping off point. Is a good point to start.
Yeah. We feel that Wikipedia is a good jumping off point to start research because it lists all of these various resources at the bottom of the article and tells where each source is and gives you links or gives you a book title and the ISBN number so you can look it up more easily. And I think that that's an extremely responsible thing to do.
Yeah.
And also, and because it does that, I think it gives you a good jumping off point. It gives you a good way to ask more questions. Say, hey, what does this source have in common with this source? And what about that one over there? What do they all have in common? What do they all dispute? And I think it's a good way to help figure out what's really going on.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm saying what Wikipedia says on the subject matter. And it said that for so long, and it's had so many edits done that I think based on that and on the fact that it lists some fairly reputable sources for the same John being responsible for the gospel and the letters and the book of Revelation, that I think it's correct. What do you think, honey?
I think there's a pretty good chance it is.
So that's what we know, and they're all called the Johannine works.
Yes.
After the Latin form of John's name. So there you go. And that's about when he was writing again. It was approximately 85 and 100 AD. The final epistle is the Epistle of Jude.
Hey, Jude, don't make it sad. Sorry, I can't do much squat.
It's okay, honey. Hey, Jude. Take a sad song and make it better. The minute you let her under your skin, then you begin to make it better. Okay, I'm done. I promise. But yeah, we're Beatles fans in this house too. No, St. Jude is actually one of the shortest books in the Bible. This book is actually one of the shortest books in the Bible. It's only 25 verses long.
Yes.
It is an encyclical letter, which means that unlike the Pauline epistles, it wasn't written to one particular church, but to be circulated amongst all of the churches, which is pretty cool. It says that it's written by Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James. We don't know if that's James the Just, who is also referred to as James, the brother of Jesus, and was a prominent leader in the early church. Or if it's another James, maybe. Of course, if he was the brother of James the Just, it traditionally would mean that Jude was also the brother of Jesus. But then there's something else that we have to take into context. Because brother or sister back in the day did not necessarily mean you shared both parents or even just one parent.
Could also mean cousin or nephew.
Yes. It could also mean cousin or nephew. And so, really, any close relative would be your brother or your sister. There's another Mary in the Bible, too, who's referred to as the sister of the Virgin Mary.
Yeah.
But we know that they're obviously not sisters in the modern sense of the word, because really, who names both of their daughters with the same exact name? Nobody, especially not back in the ancient world, right?
No, but back then there were multiple forms of the name Mary that we translate just as Mary.
That's true, because you had Miriam or Mariam.
Uh-huh.
So,
Mariadne.
yes. But, in fact, we know that those two Marys were actually cousins. And so we wonder, okay, is James the Just and thus his brother Jude, are they actually brothers, probably stepbrothers of Jesus in the modern sense? Or are they cousins and thus would have been called brothers under the ancient terminology, or what? We don't know.
Yeah.
We do know that Clement of Alexandria wrote a commentary on this epistle. We think that he might have been an apostle.
Yeah.
But we can't say one way or another. We know that it's very similar to 2 Peter, especially chapter 2 of 2 Peter. And so scholars say that there's a dependence between the two, and that one or the other, and that one influenced the other, and they're not completely sure which. So we don't know for sure exactly on that. So there it is. There is the book of Jude for your learning pleasure. And finally, we get to the end of the Bible, the book of Revelation. The word comes from the Greek apocalypsis, which is also where we get the word apocalypse. And guess what? It doesn't mean end of the world. It means
hidden, uncovered, revealed.
The most common date given for this is 95 AD, approximately. Now remember what we've said repeatedly about apocalyptic literature. Popular literary genre, prophetic but not necessarily about the end times, because it's useful to bitch about the king, or in this case, the emperor. The mark of the beast is given as 666. Boys and girls, have we got news for you? Let us tell you about a little something called gematria. What is
Gematria is Hebrew numerology.
It is.
And
Numbers are assigned to names.
yes, and it's based on the Hebrew spelling of the name. 666 is equivalent to the Greek spelling of the name Gaius Nero Caesar. 616 is equivalent to the Hebrew spelling of that name.
Yes. And at the time that John of Patmos was writing the book of Revelation, sitting there in exile on the island of Patmos, there were prophecies that Nero would come back and go right back to persecuting Christians like he had done before. And when you look at, and like Michael just explained, it's not even actually 666. That's what it comes out to is Greek form. Hebrew, it's 616. But we have the Greek form and 666 because, like the rest of the New Testament, the book was written in Greek. So there you all go. That is all of the books of the New Testament.
Oh, and like the rest of the Bible, if you look into the Nag Hammadi and other Gnostic scripts, you will find other apocalypses.
Yes, you will. So stay tuned next week for our final part 4 of this episode, when we will be discussing the actual canonization process, not of saints, the creating of the canon of the scriptures. And we will be covering also some of the more popular translations and where they came from, etc. So thank you all for watching. Be sure to look below for links to parts 1 and 2. When we finish uploading part 4 next week, we will add in a link to part 4 as well. And also, don't forget to hit subscribe and to click that link in the description for our Facebook page, and make sure that you like and follow our Facebook page as well if you haven't already, for a daily history fact and every Friday a creepy Friday fact. Thanks y'all for watching, and have a good one.